For nearly 2,000 years, educated people accepted an entire historical framework that was never independently verified. One of the biggest mistakes intelligent people make is confusing confidence with evidence. For centuries, biblical history wasn't demonstrated, it was assumed. And because it was assumed long enough, it became history. Today, nearly every one of those assumptions has collapsed. The question isn't whether religion got a few stories wrong. The question is how an entire civilization mistook mythology for history. That's what we're talking about in today's conversation. Now, before we begin, don't forget to like and share the video, and also take a moment to subscribe to the channel so that you never miss a video drop or a live stream. Let's get into it. Last week, I released a video that ruffled some feathers challenging the historicity of Jesus. Today, I want to talk about something that not only further challenges his existence, but challenges the very foundation the character emerges from. Based on the narrative, the existence of a Jesus is dependent not only on the historicity of the Gospels, but also the historicity of the Hebrew Bible, what many Christians recognize as the Old Testament. Because Jesus does not exist in a vacuum and is allegedly the product of a lineage of a divinely chosen people, his existence as written is dependent on the existence of a historical Adam and Eve, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Moses. Simply put, if significant characters of the Old Testament did not exist, then the foundational requirement that necessitates a Savior, Messiah, or Redeemer is effectively null and void. If through Adam sin did not enter the world, then Jesus is just a literary plot device that has overstayed its welcome in serious contemporary thought. Let's start at the beginning. Adam and Eve are perhaps the clearest example of a biblical pair whose status has changed radically over the last 150 years. Unlike Jesus, whose basic historicity is still debated within clear methodological boundaries, Adam and Eve are no longer regarded by the overwhelming majority of specialists as historical individuals. But the important distinction is actually why. It isn't simply because there is no evidence, though that is undeniably true. It's because multiple independent fields have produced concrete converging evidence that is fundamentally incompatible with the existence of a single first human couple from whom all humanity descends. For most of Western history, Adam and Eve weren't treated as purely religious figures. They were accepted as literal ancestors whose story anchored early anthropology, racial classifications, and global chronologies. Scholars routinely calculated the exact date of creation, traced all world nations back to Noah's sons, and fitted all of human history into a strict biblical timeline. Over the last 2 centuries, however, that framework didn't just bend under modern scientific scrutiny, it completely collapsed and was replaced by a fundamentally different model of human origins. The hardest blow came from population genetics. By analyzing whole genomes, mutation rates, mitochondrial DNA, and Y chromosome lineages, geneticists proved that modern Homo sapiens evolved out of a breeding pool that was never smaller than roughly 10,000 individuals during our species' emergence. That's a lot of Adams, Eves, Steves, and Genevies to even consider. Human genetic diversity simply cannot be compressed into a single couple living a few thousand years ago. A bottleneck that even prominent Christian geneticists like Francis Collins have acknowledged as genetically impossible, not just implausible, impossible. At the same time, paleoanthropology demonstrated that humanity emerged gradually across millions of years, moving from Australopithecus through Homo erectus down to Neanderthals, Denisovans, and modern humans, leaving no point in the fossil record where two uniquely created beings suddenly appeared. Like magic. Outside of biology, archaeology has turned up zero physical evidence for Eden, its sacred trees, or a foundational civilization descending from one family. Meanwhile, comparative mythology and literary analysis revealed that Genesis 2 and 3 were never written as modern historical reporting. With its talking serpents, archetypal characters, and explanations for why snakes crawl or why childbirth is painful, Genesis employs the standard literary devices of ancient Near Eastern origin stories, sharing direct thematic links with older regional works like the Epic of Gilgamesh and Enuma Elish. Ultimately, these fields did not merely push scholars to reinterpret Genesis, they completely dismantled the historical premise. While a few religious thinkers still craft revised models to salvage a literal pair, Adam and Eve have officially moved in general scholarly consensus from historical ancestors to profound theological, literary, and symbolic figures. But if that was all we had, this wouldn't even be a conversation worth having. Let's move on to Noah and his ark. Moving from the dawn of creation to the second foundation of humanity, we reach Noah, another figure whose status transformed from historical cornerstone to ancient mythology. For centuries, Noah wasn't merely treated as a Sunday school hero or religious symbol. In standard Western historical accounts, he was understood as a literal survivor of a global deluge, the builder of an immense wooden ark, and the single bottleneck ancestor through whom every living human population was preserved and scattered across the earth. European scholars routinely organized human races, language, and global migrations by tracing entire nations back to Noah's three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. The Mormons still do it today. But when we apply modern scientific and historical testing to this narrative, the foundational evidence simply isn't there. The fundamental issue here is whether there is any evidence for the identifiable individual described in Genesis and the cataclysmic events that define his life. Outside of the Bible, there is no independent confirmation, no contemporary inscription, administrative record, monument, or archaeological artifact identifying Noah, his family, the ark, or a global demographic reset. And because the story relies on a worldwide flood and a recent population bottleneck, both of which are directly contradicted by physical evidence, Noah cannot be extracted from the text and salvaged as a normal historical figure. The primary physical barrier to Noah's historicity is that a global flood, as described in Genesis, simply never occurred. The biblical text describes a deluge that covered every mountain, wiped out all land dwelling air breathers, and reduced humanity to 8 individuals. An event of that magnitude would leave unmistakable, globally synchronized geological markers. Yet, Earth's rock layers tells an entirely different story. Geology shows local and regional floods occurring across vastly different eras, interspersed with glacial periods, volcanic eruptions, and long dry spells that could never form during a single catastrophic year. While geology can identify massive regional megafloods, such as the Missoula floods in the American Northwest, the complete absence of a single synchronized global flood layer isn't just a lack of evidence, it actively disproves the Genesis scenario. Furthermore, human history proceeded completely uninterrupted during the time frame where the biblical flood should sit. Established civilizations in Egypt and Mesopotamia show continuous cultural, political, and material records across this period. Their writing systems, architecture, and settlements don't vanish only to be restarted by a single displaced family. They continue uninterrupted. Human genetics tells the exact same story. To compress all modern genetic diversity down to 4 breeding couples a few thousand years ago would produce severe inbreeding signatures, a drastic collapse in variation, and a clear demographic reset across every continent. Genetics shows no such bottleneck in human history. In fact, biogeography makes the story even more impossible. There is no plausible mechanism by which marsupials traveled exclusively to Australia or lemurs to Madagascar, especially not from a single landing site in the Near East without leaving intermediate populations or ecological trace behind. Ultimately, the strongest historical evidence surrounding Noah isn't evidence for Noah. It's evidence that his story is the Israelite adaptation of a much older Mesopotamian tradition. Centuries before Genesis took its final form, texts like the Neo Assyrian Epic of Gilgamesh and the older Atrahasis epic featured flood heroes like Upnapishtim and Ziusudra, who were warned by gods, built massive vessels, saved living creatures, grounded on mountains, and released birds to test the receding waters. This should sound very familiar. Noah is not the original flood survivor in the literary record. He's Israel's version of a shared evolving Near Eastern flood hero archetype. While a catastrophic regional flood in ancient Mesopotamia may well have inspired these early legends, the biblical Noah himself remains what modern consensus now recognizes as a mythological figure embedded within an ancient literary tradition. But then there's also the patriarchs: Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Let's deal with all of them together. As we move past the primordial origins of humanity and the global flood, we arrive at the founding fathers of the covenant: Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. For centuries, these patriarchs were regarded not merely as religious icons, but as the literal historical founders of the Israelite people. Standard historical accounts place them in the early second millennium BCE, tracing their migrations across Canaan, their covenantal encounters, and the birth of the 12 tribes that formed the bedrock of Israel's national identity. During the 19th and early 20th centuries, scholars fully expected that the emerging field of Near Eastern archaeology would confirm these stories. Today, however, that historical reconstruction is no longer supported by the consensus of modern scholarship. Unlike Adam or Noah, where fields like genetics and geology actively disprove the physical possibility of the narratives, The issue with the patriarchs is purely historical. Over a century of intensive archaeological excavation across Mesopotamia and the Levant has yielded zero contemporary inscriptions, administrative records, or external documentation naming Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob. Unlike later kings, Omri, Hezekiah, or Jehu, who appear in external Assyrian and Moabite records, the patriarchs exist exclusively within biblical tradition. Where early scholars hoped to uncover Abraham's migration path or patriarchal encampments, archaeology instead revealed that the Israelite population emerged primarily from within Canaan itself, rather than arriving as the descendants of a single immigrant family. Furthermore, literary analysis reveals that the patriarchal stories are saturated with anachronisms, details that reflect the world of the Iron Age monarchy centuries after Abraham supposedly lived. The narratives routinely reference place names, political realities, and social dynamics that didn't exist in the Middle Bronze Age. Rather than functioning as real time eyewitness biographies, these texts read as retrojected national origin stories, designed to explain how later Israel understood its identity, its geography, and its relationships with neighboring kingdoms. This symbolic design is nowhere clearer than in the figure of Jacob. Jacob's name is literally changed to Israel, and his 12 sons directly personify the 12 tribes. In ancient literature, this is a classic ideological pattern, constructing ancestral figures to explain why later political and tribal boundaries exist. In this sense, historians often compare the patriarchs to Rome's stories of Romulus or Greece's heroic founders, not necessarily to diminish them as crude fabrications, but to recognize that they function as national ancestral traditions rather than recoverable biographies. For centuries, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were treated as the historical founders of Israel. As archaeology expanded across the Near East, historians expected independent evidence for the patriarchs to emerge. Instead, the evidence accumulated everywhere except around the patriarchs themselves. Cities, kingdoms, inscriptions, trade networks, and neighboring peoples came into sharper historical focus. But Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob remain known only through the biblical tradition. Now we have one more stop before I make my big point. Moses. Let my people go. When we step out of the book of Genesis and into Exodus, we meet Moses, perhaps the single most consequential figure in the entire Hebrew Bible. For centuries, Moses was treated not merely as a religious prophet, but as a foundational pillar of human history. He was understood as an Egyptian raised Hebrew prince, the liberator of an enslaved nation, the agent of 10 divine plagues, the lawgiver of Sinai, and the military organizer who forged 12 disparate tribes into a nation. Because Moses' identity is inseparable from massive political, demographic, and supernatural events involving the regional superpower of his day, he was never viewed as an obscure figure who might have quietly lived and died. Yet, when tested against standard historical and archaeological criteria, not a single claim defining his life can be independently verified. Despite centuries of intensive excavation and the recovery of thousands of Egyptian administrative documents, inscriptions, and monuments, there is no contemporary record that mentions Moses. He's absent from royal court registers, military accounts, and diplomatic correspondence. This absence is particularly striking because the story places Moses at the very center of an unprecedented national disaster. The destruction of Egyptian crops and livestock, the death of firstborn children, the loss of Pharaoh's army, and the sudden departure of a massive slave labor force. While royal propaganda certainly omitted military embarrassments, an economic and demographic collapse on this scale would leave unavoidable archaeological and administrative scars. The historical difficulty deepens because the text itself fails to provide basic identifying details to anchor Moses in history. The story describes a child adopted by a royal family and raised in the heart of imperial power, yet it never names the pharaoh who ordered the infant killings, the princess who rescued Moses, the court that raised him, or the ruler he eventually confronted. The royal family remains entirely anonymous. Furthermore, the geographical route of the Exodus is equally unmapped. Decades of research have failed to produce an agreed upon location for the Sea of Reeds, dishonestly remembered as the Red Sea. Y'all heard about that one. The wilderness encampments, or Mount Sinai itself, leaving us with a central protagonist who lacks both a verifiable biography and an identifiable landscape. Moreover, the physical scale of the Exodus conflicts directly with archaeology and demographics. The biblical text records roughly 600,000 adult men fleeing Egypt, which translates to a total migrating population of over 2 million people. A demographic shift of that size moving through the harsh Sinai Peninsula for 40 years would leave vast, unmistakable archaeological footprints, temporary encampments, pottery, animal bones, hearths, and even burial sites. Yet no such evidence exists. While modern historians fully acknowledge that Semitic populations lived in the Nile Delta and moved between Egypt and Canaan, as Canaan was a subject of Egyptian authority, evidence of routine border migration is not evidence for a 2 million person exodus led by a prince turned prophet. In fact, the famous Merneptah stele, dated to around 1208 BCE, proves that a group called Israel was already established inside Canaan by the late 13th century, with archaeological evidence showing they largely emerged from indigenous local populations rather than a massive external invasion. Literary and comparative analysis offers the clearest explanation for how this story developed. Moses' infancy narrative, a threatened child placed in a reed basket, floated down a river, rescued by royalty, and destined for greatness, mirrors an older Near Eastern literary motif best known from the Sargon birth legend of Akkad. Furthermore, Moses serves a classic literary role as the ultimate idealized national founder. He's simultaneously a prince, fugitive, miracle worker, judge, military leader, prophet, and covenantal mediator. Moses is literally wearing all of the hats and doing all of the things. Assigning all of a culture's legal systems, religious rituals, and founding myths to a single heroic ancestor was a standard practice across the ancient world. Ultimately, while memories of small escape labor groups or an early leader with an Egyptian sounding name may well lie buried deep within the tradition, Moses himself functions in modern historical consensus not as a recoverable biographical figure, but as Israel's legendary national founder and lawgiver. So now I want to talk about the reality behind these stories. The absence of verifiable history doesn't mean these stories were meaningless, but it does mean that treating them as objective historical truth is a profound mistake. Ancient peoples routinely blurred history, mythology, political identity, and divine right. When a developing culture wanted to justify its laws, claim a territory, or delegitimize its neighbors, it didn't write a neutral history book. It adapted older Near Eastern myths and narrated itself into divine significance. Adam was used to frame a local worldview as universal human nature. Noah served to place the community on the righteous side of a cosmic destruction. Abraham created an ancient, unquestionable deed to a land before the nation even existed. Jacob unified distinct local tribes by retroactively turning them into blood brothers. Moses transformed human laws and social agreements into absolute, unchallengeable divine decrees. Recognizing how these stories were built isn't an excuse to honor them as history. In fact, the insistence on treating these mythological origin stories as literal history has caused immense human suffering throughout centuries. When human made territorial claims are elevated to divine inheritance, land becomes non negotiable. When Bronze Age laws are mistaken for the literal voice of God, questioning them becomes a sin. And when ancient literary heroes are treated as historical ancestors, arbitrary tribal divisions are weaponized for generations. Peace in the Middle East. Ultimately, we have to call these narratives what they actually are: ancient origin myths created by specific human communities to serve specific political and theological interests. They tell us virtually nothing about the literal lives of Adam, Noah, Abraham, Jacob, or Moses. But understanding their lack of historicity is vital, because as long as myth is masquerading as historical fact, it will continue to be used to justify real world division and violence. Now let's address the elephant in the room. To understand how we ended up here, we have to look at how Western thought operated for nearly 2 millennia. For roughly 1500 to 18,000 years, from the early church fathers straight through to the 19th century, figures like Adam and Eve, Noah, the patriarchs, and Moses were received as straightforward historical reality. They weren't just preached from pulpits, they were incorporated into standard global chronologies, maps, and historical textbooks without modern empirical testing. For generations, scholarly consensus operated on a default presumption of historicity, the uncritical rule that an ancient narrative should be treated as true until proven false. An entire ecosystem of academic, theological, and historical consensus was built on claims that were fundamentally unverified. The realization that scholars had been taking these stories at face value without actual proof began during the 18th century Enlightenment and accelerated through the 19th and early 20th centuries. As fields like geology, evolutionary biology, historical linguistics, and Near Eastern archaeology emerged, researchers finally started testing the text against the physical world 1800 years later. What they discovered was that centuries of European scholarship had simply inherited dogmatic assumptions rather than investigating evidence. This total failure of due diligence happened through a self reinforcing cycle of institutional authority and confirmation bias. For centuries, universities were tied directly to religious institutions, meaning that questioning foundational narratives carried severe social, financial, or career risks. When biblical archaeology first emerged in the 19th century, researchers routinely went into the field explicitly looking to prove the Bible, interpreting ambiguous dirt and pottery to fit their pre existing faith rather than letting the evidence lead the hypothesis. On top of that, until the decipherment of cuneiform and Egyptian hieroglyphics in the 19th century, the Bible held a virtual textual monopoly. It was often the only surviving ancient text for the region, leaving scholars with no comparative baseline to check its claims. And I don't think that happened on accident. This historical blind spot carries a vital lesson for how we evaluate ancient claims today. Academic consensus is not immune to ideological capture. Ancient texts, including biblical ones, were written as theology, political propaganda, identity construction, and origin mythology, not objective history. When we approach sacred texts without demanding rigorous independent verification from genetics, archaeology, and comparative literature, we inevitably end up mistaking literary symbolism for historical fact. By the time we reach Moses, the pattern is no longer difficult to see. Adam and Eve were treated as the first human beings. Noah was treated as the survivor of a worldwide flood and the ancestor of every later nation. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were treated as the historical founders of Israel. Moses was treated as the liberator, the lawgiver, and architect of an entire religious civilization. These were not minor characters on the edges of the tradition. They were the foundation. And one by one, when the stories were subjected to the standards of verifiable history, the foundation began to disappear, to collapse in on itself. There is no historical Adam. There is no verified Noah, no recoverable Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob. There is no independently established Moses. The people, kingdoms, and cultures surrounding these stories sometimes enter the historical record. The central characters do not. That pattern cannot be treated as irrelevant when we reach the New Testament. It's time to bring the same scrutiny to Jesus, the apostles, and even the figures later remembered as the fathers of the early church, because this tradition has repeatedly demanded historical trust that it did not earn. The existence of a religious text is not evidence that its characters existed. A later tradition is not contemporary testimony. A familiar name is not verification. And a story placed among real rulers, cities, and political events does not become history simply because the scenery is historical. After this many false assumptions, why would we continue granting the tradition the benefit of the doubt? Why should the New Testament be treated as historically reliable before its central figures have been independently established? Why should the assumptions begin again simply because we've crossed from one collection of sacred books into another? An institution that begins with a lie often doesn't stop with one. It's like Pringles in that way. In the words of the infamous Ray Charles, played by Jamie Foxx, scratch a lie, find a thief. And that raises a question larger than whether these characters existed. What has treating these stories as history stolen from us? What happened when mythology was transformed into ancestry, when legend became law, when national propaganda became divine revelation, when theological characters were treated as authorities over real human lives? These stories have consequences. They've been used to define human nature, justify hierarchy, regulate sexuality, establish gender roles, authorize conquest, defend slavery, divide populations, and frighten generations of people with consequences supposedly established at the beginning of time. Adam was used to explain why humanity was corrupt, Abraham to legitimize sacred bloodlines and territorial entitlement. Moses was used to place evolving legal systems beyond human challenge. Once these figures were accepted as historical, the institutions built upon them gained the appearance of ancient supernatural authority. The question is therefore not merely whether Adam, Abraham, and Moses existed. The question is what became possible once people believed that they did. If Adam never existed, then there was no historical fall requiring humanity to be rescued from inherited sin. If Abraham cannot be established, then the covenantal ancestry claimed through him is not verifiable history. If Moses can't be established, then the divine origin assigned to Mosaic law loses its historical foundation. And if these foundational characters are literary and legendary rather than historical, then what exactly is Judaism? What exactly is Christianity? What exactly is Islam? These traditions don't merely mention Adam, Abraham, and Moses, they build their entire identities around them. Judaism grounds covenant, law, and national ancestry in Abraham and Moses. Christianity interprets Jesus as the answer to a condition traced back to Adam and as the fulfillment of promises given through Abraham, Moses, and the prophets. Islam presents Adam, Noah, Abraham, and Moses as genuine prophets within a continuous history culminating in Muhammad. Remove the assumption that these figures were historical, and the traditions do not simply lose a few stories. They lose the historical sequence through which they explain themselves. What remains may still be literature, it may still be ritual, it may still be philosophy, cultural memory, moral reflection, or even community identity, but it can no longer honestly present itself as a divinely directed chain of historical events without first demonstrating that the chain existed. That scrutiny should not stop at the edge of the Hebrew Bible. The next question is unavoidable. If the foundations repeatedly disappear when examined, what happens when we examine the structure built on top of them? Thank you for joining me in today's conversation. Listen, are you tired of living in false assumptions and the misunderstandings of yesterday? Because that's precisely why I do this content. It's not just to raise the flag of, ooh, religion bad. It's to help those of you who are earnestly trying to live life without being encumbered by the superstitions of those who came before us. And it's not just because I want religion to lose, it's because I want humanity to win. That's why I'm not just producing content, I'm also heavily invested in building post religious community. We're bringing third spaces back without the religious twist, not a fan club or a debate group or even a clique for Bible hating atheists, which I honestly find to be both boring and pedantic. I think our best foot forward is not just what we're able to tear down, but what we're also able to build up. And that's why at Bridge City, we're working on building bridges to better outcomes. My content is about deconstruction, but our community is about connection. And if that's something you're looking for, check us out. It's absolutely free to join, and the link is in the description. And for those of you not quite ready to commit to a community, but you want to support the work, consider becoming a patron or making a one time donation through PayPal or Cash App. Those links are also in the description below. That's all the time I have for now. If you have thoughts on today's video, please share them in the comments. And as always, until next time, keep rising.